you very much. Good to see you all. And since you've already heard me speak and you still came, that's even awesome. I am a person who started out as a youth pastor, which comes out in some of the ways that I talk. I started out as a youth pastor, then I became a missions pastor. And my goal as a missions pastor was, if I could use these words, to missionize the congregation. In other words, to help every person realize that we all have a part to play in God's global mission. Whether it's by prayer, or by finance, or short-term mission, or hosting international students, or being involved in teaching English as a second language, or hanging out at the A&W and meeting the Indian lady there every Sunday and talking with her during break time. I mean, all of us have a role to play, and I'm a very much cookies on the lowest shelf. You know what that means? I like simple. Right? One of my first suggestions was to tell people to buy a world map shower curtain. So that at least once or twice a day they'd be praying for the nations of the earth. Right? And in my country, the USA, it's regrettable how little we know about much of the world. Right? And the United States is 5% of the world's population. But if you listen to most of us, we make it sound like we're the center of the universe. And that Canada is actually our 51st state. Which I know for sure that's not true. Anyhow, so I just thought I'm going to make 5 statements about the global church just to sort of prime the pump. I would like to take questions about, the church around the world as opposed to questions about whether the Bruins can beat the Canucks, or whatever. So, but 5 statements. Number 1 is the global church is incredibly diverse. Your church represents that to a degree, but the vast majority of Christians in the world today are from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. According to statistics, 70% of the Bible-believing Christians live in the countries that used to be the recipients of missionaries. And it's very diverse. It's diverse theologically. From far one-way Pentecostal to high church Anglican. To high church Anglican that when you go to the services you can't tell that they're not Pentecostal. All right? And very much some of them living in Bible times, if you will. If somebody falls out the 3rd story window, you don't call 911, you just pray for them because that's what they did in the Bible. And I love to tell Christians who were raised in the tradition I was raised in, namely that it's called cessationism, the belief that miracles and signs and wonders ceased with the apostles in the 1st century. I always tell people, if that is your theological belief, that miracles, signs, and wonders were for the 1st century only, my comment is don't travel. Because the diverse church around the world didn't get the memo that things had ceased, and so when the person dies, they pray for them to be raised up. My first time ever in Nigeria, they gave me a young man to carry my bag, which is to be polite to old people, I guess. And he's carrying my bag. So finally, about the 3rd day, I asked him, how did you become a Christian? He says, Brother Matthew raised me from the dead. At which point I thought, my testimony about becoming a Christian at the youth retreat is kind of lame. I need to come up with a better testimony. But it's very, very diverse, ranging from secret house churches in some places, worshiping, in environments of persecution, to a worship center I went to in southern Nigeria. The worship center is 3 kilometers by 3 kilometers. That's 1.8 miles, Americans, 1.8 miles by 1.8 miles. And during the Holy Ghost Conference, they can seat 2.6 million people under continuous roofing with drop-down screens and dirt floors. Wow. So it's incredibly diverse. Second comment about the church around the world. Because it's diverse, here's the main thought. Because the church around the world is so diverse, we need to have diverse people doing diverse ministries working together. Multicultural teams, if you will. Because sometimes people listen to a foreigner more than they listen to their own people, and sometimes only their own people can speak a language that they understand. So it's all together, working together. Number 2, the majority of our global church is non-white, non-Western, non-wealthy, and if you understand this theologically, sometimes non-Westminster, meaning their orthodox theology might not be the same as ours. All right? Any place I go, they're struggling with the issue of eternal salvation. Can you lose your salvation? This kind of thing. But that's all to say, it's something we need to wrestle with, because if we go out into the parts of the world that have not yet been reached, it's going to be a place where those of us of European heritage might feel quite uncomfortable. Right? But we need to realize, those of us of European heritage, that we ourselves are now becoming the minority in the Christian family. Okay? I was speaking in Atlanta, Georgia, which is in the south, and it was in this country club, and the country club attenders at this luncheon it was a major whiteout. You know what I mean? It was white skin and white hair by and large. And I said, if Jesus tarries, if Jesus delays his coming, heaven will be predominantly non-white. And they were like, they were just shocked, because they live in a world of greater segregation. And I said, heaven will be non-white. And like one of the ladies was asked, well, there'll be a room for us though, right? You missed the point, lady. You missed the point. But global mission and ministry demands a global team. Number 3 statement. The church around the world needs to go deeper into discipleship and wider into their communities. Deeper, because missions in general has profoundly succeeded in making converts. But Jesus didn't command us to make converts. He commanded us to make disciples. So 100% all-in followers of Jesus, not Christmas and Easter followers of Jesus, right? And that's not just true it's true in my country, it might be true in Canada, I don't know. But around the world, people will lament the fact that the church in our country is miles wide and inches deep. And where you see it is when persecution comes. Because people won't go to church on Christmas and Easter alone if they're going to get killed for being a Christian. And so persecution does have a refining effect, not always, and you can ask a question about that if you want to. And it needs to go wider, because in every culture, in every land, when the church grows, it instinctively starts turning inward. We start spending more money on the maintenance of ourselves than on the global mission, or even on the community mission. And that's, again, it's true around the world. And you get comfortable, and all of a sudden the goal of the older adults is to preserve the kids in the church. When I was in youth group, the church would ask, we want you to come to our church. We don't want to lose our young people. So the idea was the church becomes this sort of like fortress against the world, as opposed to a military base training the soldiers to go into the world. Right? A fourth statement, I should say, the church around the world needs pioneering in some places, meaning people going in as pioneers, and it needs resurrection and renewal in other places. I met a brother here, he's from the Malayali speaking group of Southwest India. They trace their heritage back to Thomas the Apostle. Right? So they've been around a while. They don't need pioneers. But many of them are nominally Christian and really need to be on fire for sharing the gospel for the rest of their 1,600 ethnic group country. There are 1,600 or more, Operation World would know the exact answer, 1,600 ethnic groups in India. And some of the most equipped to do that are the ones that have had Christianity the longest. But when we forget that what God has called us for, we need resurrection and renewal. And the last statement is, the kingdom of Christ is moving forward through dynamic partnerships. The Canadian church partnering with the Sudanese church to care for refugees in Kenya. Or the church in Toronto partnering with the brother Dominic that I met, who had been a missionary. Dominic, where? Philippines? Where was Dominic? Oh, he's probably out doing evangelism. He had been a missionary in the Philippines, but he's from Pakistan. That kind of partnership. Because everybody brings something unique to the table. And I remember one time during the second Gulf War, I was speaking in Oregon, USA, and this young man came up to me. He says, "What do you think about Americans going to Iraq as missionaries?" And I looked at him and I said, "You mean you American or me American?" Because he was Korean American. And I said, "Well, they're not going to immediately label you as an American, so go for it." He said, "Thanks. I've already been going 5 times. You just want me to bless them." But the point being that with a diverse community, some of you, how many of you have Canadian passports? Okay. You need to look at your Canadian passport like Paul looked at his Roman citizenship. Your Canadian passport can get you to places that I can't go, or at least can't go easily. How many of you speak English? All right, good, most. I have a friend who has been an English teacher in Libya for most of his life. He told me if you have English speakers that are willing to go teach conversational English, he says, I can get them into Libya. Canadians can get into Libya. Right? You can't get out, but you can get in. And Jesus said go, he didn't say come back. So. But it's just a very, very exciting time to be alive, and from that point on, I'll take it. Well, let me say it one more time. I believe that outside of the time that Jesus walked the earth, we are living at the most exciting time in all of Christian history. The missionaries who went and died in the 1800s and 1900s, the fruit of their death is the church around the world becoming the missionary sending force. Right? In Ghana, when the British missionaries went, the legend says they packed their earthly belongings in their own caskets, coffins, because they knew they were going to die there. And 60% of those British missionaries died in the first 2 years. Right? Now, the nation of Ghana has missionary sending agencies that have Ghanaian missionaries in 70 countries, including the man who leads international student ministry here in Canada. Some of you know Yao Purdy. And you're a Ghanaian family here, yes? Yes. So thank you for coming to reach us. I'll go out to you. All right. So, yeah, you can learn a lot just by reading the sign at the airport. Akwaba is the general welcome. Is that Akan?
Yes.
Yeah. And that's a language. I'm just trying to impress you that I know that. But actually, how many of you are bilingual? Oh, I guess the government doesn't know that. Because most of the time when you ask what somebody who speaks 3 languages is trilingual, someone who speaks 2 languages is bilingual, someone who speaks 1 language is an American. At least you have a bilingual country. Right? So are you going to be the roving mic? Yeah, so my first question is to Pastor. If Adam didn't sin, but Eve did, what would have happened? I couldn't believe it. What is that kid? He must have been 6 or 7 years old. He's walking up. Pastor, I just have a quick question. He says, Eve sinned, but Adam did. What would have happened? Time to go. So any question easier than that, I'll attempt to. All right, who would like to go first? Something over here.
Hi, I'm Carolyn. So often, you mentioned the secularism of Toronto, which is a really major thing. Often when you're speaking with someone who comes from a religious background, they've already got this idea that there's a creator, and they're almost more receptive. What do you do when you're talking with someone who has a completely relativistic worldview?
Yeah, I mentioned my friend Jack in the morning service, the guy who was the lawyer, and who thought evangelicals are always pointing their finger at him. And am I doing that? Sorry. I asked Jack, do you believe in God? He said, no. I said, where are you going when you die? He said, heaven. I said, Jack, you're a lawyer. You can't go to God's place when you don't believe in God. Just saying. He says, yes, I can.
I mean, sometimes the best thing you can do is just befriend people. You know, really, Leslie Newbegin, who came back to his own secular England after being a missionary in India, realized that everything he had to do when he worked in India, he now had to do in England. And he wrote a book called Foolishness of the Greeks about that very fact. And he said in one of his books, do your work, or I would say live your lives, in such a way so as to stimulate questions for which Jesus is the only answer. And if I could say it this way without sounding rude, I actually believe in our secular society, one of the best places for sharing our hope is at funerals. Because for many of my secular friends, it's the only time they're actually thinking about eternity. You know, they don't think about God, they don't think about where they're going when they die, until somebody they love dies, or, you know, so I mean, but I think, you know, asking questions, trying to look for hooks. You know, I just watched Bohemian Rhapsody. And really, the guy in the movie is very clearly, he's lost and looking for love. He actually has a song, I Need Somebody to Love. Right? I mean, you can use that as the trigger. You know, do you think there are a lot of people looking for love? You know, I love to go to movies with non-Christian friends and get into a discussion about what they present. Because the way they present it, you know, I mean, even to my friends, I'll say, so what you're telling me is the only absolute is there are no absolutes, which is a philosophical contradiction. But then I sound like Ravi Zacharias, and I don't understand myself at that point. But, you know, the point being, asking questions, taking an interest in their lives, you know. And my friend Jack, I'll just use him one more time, after 9/11, and 9/11/2001, Boston was deeply, deeply affected because 2 of the planes left from Boston. I had a friend on one of the planes who died on United. He worked for United Airlines. Ironically, his name was Jesus. You know? And then another lady from our church died on the plane, on the other plane. And so I called up my friend Jack afterwards. I said, Jack, you know, you any interest in going to church with me on Sunday? He says, Paul, if you think that 9/11 is stimulated by spiritual thinking, you're wrong. Right? He says, but if you want to go on a Habitat for Humanity building project, I'll go with you. So maybe the issue is get him surrounded by Christians doing something he thinks is valuable. You know? But to ask the questions, to stir the questions. And that's true even with people of other faiths. Learning to ask questions. Because, for example, if you ask a Muslim, what do you think I believe the Trinity is? Muslims generally are taught that we believe the Trinity is God the Father, Mary the Mother, and Jesus the biologically conceived Son. Well, that's something we could rectify. Or the Muslims don't necessarily believe that Jesus rose from the dead. And to me, it's a greater power to be able to be raised from the dead and conquer death than it is just to be ascended into heaven. You know, but it's a stimulating for conversation. Because if you get a good friendship, they'll actually realize, maybe I didn't understand. And now you told me something different. I have a friend, Mustafa, from Libya. I explained to him that not everybody in America was Christian. Right? Because he was associating everything with American culture, ranging from liquor to lottery, was Christian. And I said, there's a lot of people who are nominal Christians, by name only. And he had never realized that. Can I tell one funny story about it? Well, I took, in our culture, you know, my culture, you honor someone by taking them to a restaurant. In most majority world cultures, you dislike someone, so you take them to a restaurant. So I actually explained to my international friends, I'm honoring you in our cultural way. So I asked Mustafa to go with me to this restaurant. And we got there, and the lady waiting on us was a brand new immigrant from Pakistan. And he ended up explaining to her where the nearest prayer center was. So I said to my wife, I'm a great evangelist. I invited Mustafa for lunch, and now the mosque is even fuller. But I said to Mustafa, now we bless our food as Christians. How would you bless the food? And he says, Bismillah. Is that right? It's like in the name of Allah, something like that. Right? So then he invites me to his house, because that's the way he honors him. right? So we get there, and he says, Paul, I said the prayer last time, why don't you say the prayer? I said, well, Mustafa, I'm going to pray like I actually know God, and I'm talking to him directly. And you might interpret that as a blasphemy. You know what he said? Bismillah. In other words, let's eat. But the point is, friendship is the best way to advertise Jesus. Your friendship, your love, your kindness. Thank you. Another question. I'll try to be short next time. Sean.
You mentioned hosting international students, and my wife and I actually are a home state family for international students. Many of them, same sort of thing. Oh, you're a Canadian, you're Christian. I said, no. I said, we're not a Christian family the way you think we are. I said, and they see this, and they see that we are actually different than the culture at hand. And we're able to ask them questions. Many of them never heard about Jesus. These are young people, many of them from Japan and other countries, and never heard about Jesus, never heard about church, never heard about Christianity. And so God is actually bringing people to our house.
Yeah.
And he's like, you live out your life, minister to them. So we really believe that's a wonderful way to be living out our life as Christians.
Yeah. And international students has, reaching the world that's come to us. And one of the things, like my story about the Princess of Bhutan, many of the international students who come are going to be leaders in their countries, right? My brother-in-law passed away when he was 47. He was never married, so my wife and I were in charge of his estate. He went to Harvard, graduated. Everybody know what Harvard is? I didn't know if I was saying it right. He went to Harvard, and he graduated in 1973. And we were going through his yearbook, right? And my wife's maiden name was Colazo. My father-in-law is Rocco Colazo. I'm not making that up. We're thumbing through, we get to the B's. And on the page before my brother-in-law is the picture of Benazir Bhutto, who became the Prime Minister of Pakistan. Her father was the Prime Minister of Pakistan, and she was later assassinated when she was running again for Prime Minister of Pakistan. But I thought to myself, she was literally 10 miles from my house, 3 miles from my wife's house. And I wonder if anybody even welcomed her. International students. You work with international students, yes, brother? We'll tell you how, in the U.S., they'll tell you, some staggering statistic, like 80% of international students never get to see the inside of an American home. I don't know if that's true in Canada.
Probably.
But the reality is, imagine going back to your mother country thinking that college dorm life is normal life. Now, maybe you all went to Christian schools and you played and fasted all day, but I went to a secular school where drugs were dealt on my floor, not by me. But the point being, reaching out to the international students and welcoming them. And we have a couple at our church that reaches out at local campuses looking specifically from students from the People's Republic of China. And one of their funniest stories was they were walking around town just praying for divine appointments on a Saturday. They had these 4 scholars, they were postdoc students at MIT. And they said, can we help you with anything? Because it's a historical area. And they said, well, we have a couple of questions about the history, so they asked. And then they said, and we were wondering, we've heard that church is part of American life. So could you take us to church? And they said, sure. They said, you haven't gone? They said, well, we wanted to go to church, but the only church we found was Our Lady of something. And we thought it was a woman's church. So they said, no problem, come with us. So, it's just staggering. And are you near universities here? Or you're on a main line or something like that? It is amazing. And I can tell you, most students want to get out of the dormitories to eat at a normal house. But just do some research, don't offer pork chops to your Muslim friends. Just ask if there are any kind of food restrictions. Pizza seems to be actually a pretty good hit. Sir?
Yeah, so thanks for coming. My question is that in your experience of traveling around the world, what are some creative ways that you've seen, one, young people, and two, businessmen and women use their skill sets to be a part of God's global mission?
Okay, the question was, what are some creative ways I've seen young people and business people use their skill sets for God's mission? I think...
Or out of the box.
What's that?
Out of the box.
Out of the
Yeah.
box? Oh, that's not me.
Okay.
I think the first thing that I would say is, for short-term work, 90% of what you're going to do is show up. You know, meaning you're just going and visiting people in your real world. You know, and that's a big thing. Second thing is, your very question reflects our Western mindset, which is, if we're going to go, we need to have something to do. Right? And so, and that's challenging, because in many of the places that I've gone, the people will give me something to do just because they know it'll make me feel good. Right? I remember a youth training team where we put in electricity, we strung wire for like 1.5 miles across the Kalahari Desert, really, to a Bible school. And at the end of it, we celebrated, we turned on the lights. The theme of our team was bringing light to Manna. That Manna Bible Institute was the name of the place, right? And when we were doing it, Americans were jumping around because we finished our task. And the Africans were so happy that we were happy. We lived without electricity all this time, you know. But I think creativity is, when you're doing business people, you know, thinking innovatively is a big thing. You know, so getting them to ask some creative stuff, tell the most creative ideas they've ever done in their own businesses. One of the sad things that's happened in much of the church around the world is that work, as in secular work, has been deemed sort of a necessary evil, as opposed to a God-given calling. And so one of the biggest things that some of our business people have done is actually give a biblical teaching on the value of work. So in other words, you're not working just so you can tithe, just so you can support the church. And there's no sense that, you know, so I know of a businessman who has $1 gazillion. I mean, literally, he's got a lot of money. And he went to Uganda, and I told him, don't give away a dime until your 4th or 5th trip. But sit with them and help them create solutions for their own communities. And business people get pretty excited about that, because one of the things for Westerners, we go, and I'll say it this way, we go, we see the village needs water, so we dig a well, or we drill a well, and we create our well. What we want to do is create their well. The well that they will maintain after we're gone. Right? And so, you know, innovative solutions. So getting people who have, what's it called, entrepreneurial people really does well. A line operator in a business is not necessarily going to know exactly what to do. But I mean, obviously sharing your story. And for young people, it's not really out of the box, but sports is a pretty universal thing. And do Canadian young people play football as in soccer?
Mm-hmm.
They do, you know, and that would be the universal sport. You play cricket?
Some.
Yeah. That's like the ultimate most boring sport. I used to visit, my wife and I used to visit a friend in Bermuda, and they only had one TV station at the time, and it was pouring rain. You couldn't get around because you had to use mopeds. And it was a 5-day test match. It's like they took all my wickets out the first day. Sure.
Hi, my name is Jason. I'm from Barbados.
Hang on a second.
Oh,
One of the things that I think, in terms of innovation, is, and I was talking about this with Matthew, is right here in Toronto, move in. That is innovative. High risk, and putting your money where your mouth is. You know, because someone who has gifts and skills and even university education can actually be a huge benefit to the community. Excuse me, sir. Go ahead.
yeah. My name is Jason. I'm from Barbados, and pretty much it started in the faith where it was Anglican, and it was more like the Westminster system, as you mentioned, and then I saw Pentecostal, and I was like, what is this? And you know, I just wanted to ask you about your experiences in Africa, because you mentioned it about how, you know, as religions, the faith is so different in different areas. And I wonder about your experiences in Africa in terms of miracles, and is there a difference because of faith of the people, or is it also based on territory where there's spiritual authority? And I wanted to get your sense on that.
Well, I will say, I'm going to distinguish Africa for a second from sub-Saharan Africa to above Saharan Africa. All right, where the Sahara meets with basically greener Africa is a constant conflict zone right now, from Islam moving south and Christianity moving north. So there's a lot of stuff there with that, and you won't see as much of the triumphalistic name it and claim it in the middle belt there, because many of them, I was with a group of Nigerians in the middle belt, and every one of them knew someone who had died for their faith. You know, and it's not just a one-way street. You know, Christians had their churches burned down, so they retaliated and burned down mosques, which not all of our Christians behave like Jesus said. Just saying. But in terms of the enthusiasm, I've asked that question many times because I travel with insulin-dependent diabetes, and I've been traveling that way for 5 million miles. Okay, so in almost every country I go to, they want to pray to heal me, which I say, go for it, let's do it. I've been anointed with oil down in Argentina. I got prayed for by a Nigerian elder who was about the size of Shaquille O'Neal. He literally wrapped his arms around me and kicked me up. And he was shaking the diabetes out. And then my wife and I are both in our 60s, and he adds in it. You know, he's praying, Lord, heal this diabetes, make it go away. In the name of Jesus, you know, and all this kind of stuff. And he says, and Lord, open her womb, Lord. Open her womb. Whatever, my wife and I are childless, and whatever pain you've had with God, by the time you're in your 60s, you've made your peace with it. And so I'm like, but if you've got diabetes, I would pray for you in a moment. What I teach my African brothers, and Pentecostal ones especially, is healing and miracles is not a formula. So there's one group who thinks it can't happen. That's sort of my tradition I grew up in. There's the other group who thinks it always has to happen if you name it and claim it in the right way. And somewhere in between is the miraculous. You know what I mean? And so I think as the church in sub-Saharan Africa is tremendously, dangerously affected by prosperity teaching. So they're more likely to know Benny Hinn than they are to know Franklin Graham, right? And but what do you do with that? You can't just go in just condemning everything. I would say they're living much more in the times of the New Testament. And I asked one Nigerian guy, I had a pretty good relationship with. I said, why do you see so many more miracles than we do, right? And he said, well, you have more doctors. He says, if your son has 105 fever, you call 911 and take him to the hospital. If my son has 105 fever, if Jesus doesn't heal him, he dies. So there is an element of desperation. And there's an element of, I think there's an element of faith. I think I don't know Calvary Church, so if the shoe fits, put it on. And Pastor didn't tell me to say this. But I think in many of our churches in North America, we're afraid of the Holy Spirit. Because the Holy Spirit's kind of unpredictable. Like the wind, you see its effect. And as soon as you pray for someone to be healed, then you're sort of like putting God on the line. But I'm telling you, when I have pain, I'm calling my Pentecostal friends for prayer. Because my Baptist friends will pray, Lord, encourage him. Teach him whatever you wanted to learn through this. I don't want that. I want to be healed. And I've been in rooms where if faith alone could heal, I would have been healed. And my hair would have grown back. But I think the answer is, if we're going to join our brothers and sisters in other countries, we've got to be willing to be in circumstances we don't understand. And just go with it. Trust and people, because they are looking for answers too. And name it and claim it is the easiest answer, but 2 years into it, when someone has joined the church hoping for Jesus to make them healthy and wealthy, they start losing their faith because it hasn't, the bill of goods they were sold doesn't get delivered on. So, but I would say it's a matter of sort of being flexible and building enough friendship so you can speak into the situation. So are we out of time, right?
Yes, those who are parents here, you need to go and get your kids from Sunday school. I see some of them are starting to leave. Maybe just do one more question and then that'll be...
I'll do one more story. All right. I was, along your lines, I was in Cameroon, English-speaking Cameroon, which is in sort of Central Africa, with a group of Nigerian missionaries. The Nigerian church is a very powerful missionary sending church. And much of Africa is actually afraid of them coming because they are as bold and sometimes culturally insensitive as Americans have been. Right? And the British before that and the Koreans even today. Sometimes. I mean, the first generation that goes usually has overconfidence. Right? So they have that. And 20% of Africa lives in Nigeria, just to give you an idea of that. And they have the most oil, at least in sub-Saharan Africa. Anyhow, these guys had come and they were, can I say this? They were like flaming Pentecostals. Right? And I mean, the service was just wild. It was way outside of my comfort zone. And I never bounced that much. I felt more fit after being in. And I was speaking to the bishops, just like 20 of us, and I said to them, now my brothers and sisters, we need to help people learn through their pain. You know? And they were like, oh no, we pray away the pain, we pray away the pain. Well, that's what that book's about. It basically, the subtitle is How Hardship Shapes Us for Ministry and Mission. Because the older we get, the more God doesn't make pain go away. Can I get an amen from anybody? So they said, no. And they were very, very, name it and claim it, triumphalistic type of thing. I said, well, I want you to know though, there's a sickness Jesus never heals. Oh man, they were up in arms at this, They were like, no, by his stripes we are healed, which is a very favorite verse. I said, no, there's a sickness Jesus never heals. They finally quieted down. I said, what? I said, aging. Because aging is ultimately sickness, right? It's deterioration. Right? Sorry, folks, but I mean, it's reality. Why do we want to throw our mirrors away when we get older? And so I said to them, and this is me playing with them a little bit, I said, Lazarus was raised from the dead. Where's Lazarus today?
Dead.
Dead again. Right? And in West Africa, you spend thousands of dollars on funerals. Right? Got it? 7-day food for all your relatives back at the home village. I said, think of it. Lazarus' family had to pay for 2 funerals. I said, so, but the point being, we need each other. Because if we don't listen to and teach each other around the world, we'll end up worshiping a Canadian God, a USA God, or a village God. And we need somebody whose God is bigger than our village to help us understand the God of the Bible. Amen?
Amen.